here we go. So, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you are needing to have some boxes on a page, somewhere, probably in here, and you need to hide or show them depending on the state of a checkbox. And you indicate that whenever you click a button. Okay. If I'm wrong, I apologize. I dug through the thread as, as easily as Twitter would allow. Okay, so what I've done, I've made it look a little prettier than other examples just because that's kind of what I do, but I will tell you what to ignore. I will post all of this code so you can go dig through it and play with it. So what I've done to start is I've created my boxes. So I've given them, just created some divs. I've given them a class of box, a CSS class of box, so I can style them all the same. I've been given them an ID, so box 1, 2, 3, 4. IDs are unique to each element. It sends like ID, like a school ID or a government ID, IDs. And then this is just for prettification, I put the label in a span. So I've created my boxes here. I've got a form, which are my checkboxes, right? So my input, type of check, I give them a name, box 1, 2, 3, 4. I give them an ID. Don't really need this ID in my case, in this example, but we're leaving it there for completeness sake. Got my checkbox labels indicating what box goes to what box. Wow, we're going to be saying box a lot. And then I've got my button to indicate, toggle the changes. Now, there's a lot of ways you can actually accomplish this task. The way I did it is, again, the way I would do it, but there's a couple of variations. The way we're setting it up today is we are aligning the IDs of the boxes with the name attributes of the checkboxes. That way, whenever I check a box, as you'll see later, we can just take the name attribute from the ID and go straight, the name attribute from the checkbox, and go straight to the box itself. Now, we could create a generic mapping with a dictionary, object, key value mapping, and say this is the name and that's the ID, right? We could also use something called the data list attributes or data item attributes. So I could put data dash box ID equals box dash 1. And I could use this attribute to indicate what the ID is. This is just arbitrary data here. But again, I'm not going to in this case because there's multiple ways you could do this. This is just the way I set it up. So we've got our boxes, and I'm going to show you that this works first before I dig into the code. So there's no boxes visible. If I check a box, so I'm going to check box 2 and 3, and then click the button, boxes 2 and 3 should appear. And they do. So then if I check box 4, it'll appear. Now what if I check box 1 but uncheck box 3? 1, 2, 4. Perfect. So my boxes are showing, hiding, depending on the state of the checkbox. Ta-da. And yes, I can do all at once, because of course you can. Why wouldn't you be able to? Ta-da. Alright, so let's dig into the code. To start, I did a tiny bit of CSS. So you see this hidden class right here. This is the class that I'm using to, show, hide the box. I did it just a simple visibility hidden. Other examples will use display none. Display none will take the box and completely take it out of the flow of the document, and that could cause things to rearrange. I did visibility hidden for this example because visibility hidden keeps it in the flow of the document, just hides it. And so I can actually select my text here. This right here are probably box edges. That's why I did visibility hidden. The exact implementation doesn't matter. What matters here is this class of hidden. The CSS class can be applied to any element I wish, and obviously taken off and added as much as I want. And that's what I'm using to indicate that all these boxes are currently hidden. If I were to take off this hidden class real quick, box 2 appears. And that's going to be how we toggle the hidden state, by the adding and removing of this hidden class. Now to the JavaScript, which is arguably the hardest part to do, but it's not actually that hard, as we'll see. So to start, I have my simple over here in HTML, my script tag, pointing to script.js. Bam. This is 46 lines, but that's like literally half of this is comments. All right, so to start, we're going to make a query selector to a button element. So this page that we're looking at on the left, when the web browser renders a page, it creates the document object model, or the DOM. The DOM is a living, breathing organism, basically. It changes dynamically. That's what JavaScript is used for, to change the DOM. However, by default, there is no connection between what the browser creates and what JavaScript runs, what kind of JavaScript we write. We have to create a connection. So we use the query selector method on the document object to create a connection between the JavaScript and the DOM. And we're using button here, the HTML element button. And you can see there's a button on my page. There's only one button on my page, but there is a button. And it will create a single element reference, or sometimes called a node item reference, to that button. Next, we're going to create a connection to all the checkboxes on the page. This is using query selector all. So if query selector creates a single element, query selector all returns a list of multiple elements. This is handy when you need to reference multiple things. For example, my boxes here. If I wanted to create a connection to every single box, I would do query selector all dot box, dot being the indicator for a CSS indicator for a class, dot hidden. I would do dot box, and I would get a list of every single box on the page. Same thing goes here. I am getting a list of every single checkbox on the page. I'm calling it a list because that's the best way to understand it. It's technically a node list. Node lists are special. And by special, I mean they can change. But that's not going to matter here. In our case, it's just a normal list. So it's a list of elements. So we have a connection now to every single one of our checkboxes. Now we're going to jump right here real quick, line 18, and we're going to create an event listener. So JavaScript is an event-driven, object-oriented language. I don't think I need to explain object orientation, but event-driven is actually really simple. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? If I click a button, something should happen. If I put out my hand to give you a high five, then you're probably going to return it. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. JavaScript if JavaScript's event-driven, meaning every time something happens on the page, it triggers an event. And JavaScript listens for that event. If I click a button, a event named click is fired off that button. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm taking my connection, my DOM connection to the button, and adding an event listener. And I'm listening for the click event. There's lots of different events. There's the hover event. Well, not technically hover. There's mouse move event. There's a mouse down, like when or key down and key up. There's a scroll event. There's a lot of different events. In this case, we just want the basic click event, which is triggered all the time. Basically, I click, 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 clicks. Event listener takes two arguments, the event we're listening for and the callback function, which is, in this case, I've called make changes. Now, one question you had was, when I create the callback function and assign it to an event listener, how do I get a reference to the thing I clicked? Well, you do because you do it through the argument of the function. So by default, whenever you assign a function to an event listener as its callback, it it assigns a parameter. It gives a parameter to the function. It's an event object. I can call it event. Some people call it EV, others just call it E. And this object is a reference to whatever element on the page triggered the event. So, be the change right here, my button. When I click this, make changes is going to receive an argument that contains an event object that references my button. In our case, because we're not actually directly interacting with the buttons, but the checkboxes instead, I can completely ignore this parameter. In fact, I can completely remove it from my function. JavaScript is funny like that. If you pass a parameter, you do not have to specify it in the receiving function. Unlike Python, for example, I'm a Python programmer, so if I create a function called makeChanges, but then I have something that automatically feeds in a parameter, Python's going to error, like, hey, this is expecting a parameter, you didn't define one. In this case, JavaScript just don't care. It just silently ignores it. So but that's what we would do if we wanted to access the button itself. But we don't. We want to access the checkboxes. So what we're going to do, we're just going to ignore that event and jump down. And we're going to go checkboxes.forEach. For each. Back in Python, we have a for loop. So for an item in the list, it goes through the entire list from beginning to end. For each is that same type of function. It goes from the beginning to the end. In JavaScript, a for each loop is unbreakable, meaning it must run to completion. Keep that in mind. If you have to break the loop, you would use a long form for loop, or I think it's a for of loop or something like that. In this case, we need to go through the entire thing, so we use a for each loop. Someone noted that they were not sure if a node list contained a for each attribute, the for each function. It used to not. That changed a couple of years ago, so we can just use simply for each. That was a weirdness of the specialness of node list that all the browsers decided, hey, let's fix that. So they did. So checkboxes.forEach. For each accepts a callback function. The first parameter of that function is the element or the item inside the list. So if it's checkboxes.forEach, and this is index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, element first will be whatever item is at index 0, whatever items index 1, 3, and 4, and so on, right? There's actually a second parameter to for each, and that is the index. But again, because JavaScript just doesn't care if we don't use it or reference it, we can just remove it. Ta-da! And so every time we see element here, I could actually change this to checkbox. It's just a variable name. And that would actually probably make it clearer. There we go. That would probably make it clearer for you. So now, we're looping through the list of checkboxes and we're getting a checkbox. Now remember I said earlier that I aligned the name attribute of the inputs of the checkboxes with the ID attributes of the divs. Because I did that, all I have to do inside my for each loop is create a DOM connection to every single box using the checkbox name. So I'm using the backticks here because this is string interpolation, because JavaScript finally has that. And I'm doing pound, which is the CSS selector for an ID, $, pair of curly braces, and on the inside, checkbox.name. So if it's box 0, or box 1, excuse me, this is going to look like pound box -1. That's all that's going to look like, etc. So we've created a connection, DOM connection, to every single box. Well, not every single box. We've only done it to the certain box as of right now. Like, if I'm on index 1, then I've got a connection to index 1. If I'm on index 0, I've got a connection to index 0, the box that's located there. So now each checkbox has a Boolean property called .checked. Self-explanatory. If the box is checked, I'm going to, or excuse me, if the checkbox is checked, I said we're going to be saying box a lot. If the checkbox is checked, I go to the box that I want to hide or show, right, that I created right here, the connection, and I go to the class list object, and I go to the remove function. This is a handy set of functions. There's a set of functions here in class list, add, remove, toggle, and I think a couple others, that add or remove a class from an element. So, if the box is checked, I want it visible, so I remove my hidden class. Otherwise, if it's not checked, I add the hidden class. Thinking about this real quick, I did just do an inverse and flip my positive and negatives. I probably should have done this as visible and called the class visible. But, again, there's multiple ways of doing things. So yeah, if the box is checked, I remove the hidden class and it makes it visible. But if the checkbox is not checked, I make it hidden. So, check the box, boom. So what I did there, I checked the boxes, clicked the button. Okay, so click event here, fired the event. I go through each checkbox that was checked. I create a connection to the box, corresponding square box for each checkbox. And I determine, was the checkbox checked? Well, I checked box 3. Yes, it was. So I removed the hidden class here. Checkbox 4 was checked, so I removed the hidden class. But box 1 and 2 were not checked, so I added the hidden class. If you're wondering, does that have an issue, right? Because the hidden class was already there? No, it doesn't. That doesn't create any issue. If you add a class to an element that already exists on the element, the browser doesn't care. And I can prove this over here. If I go to my DevTools, and we're going to collapse a little bit of this, so give a space here. Expand the body, expand box 1. Here we are. Box 1, hidden. There we go. Box 2, they're all hidden, right? So if I check box 2, there we go. We can see the hidden class went away. And yeah, it added hidden to box 1, but hidden was already there. It doesn't matter. The browser just silently ignores it. Bam, and we can see they reappeared. Alright, I hope that answers some of your questions.